sometimes our best intentions go awry because of our desire for worldly success and to avoid failure. That's what I want to talk about in today's video. First, I'm going to begin with a discussion of an early sutta, or early-ish sutta, that talks a little bit about Devadatta, who's known as the Buddha's evil cousin. I'll be describing that a bit. I'll turn to a contemporary example that's related, that is the cryptocurrency king Sam Bankman-Fried, and some of his good intentions, or potentially maybe good intentions, that went awry. And at the end, I'll try to tie this all together. So to begin with, Devadatta. Who was Devadatta? Well, he was the Buddha's cousin. He began as an advanced monastic under the Buddha. He was a monastic. At some point, it seems he began to have differences of opinion with the Buddha. In particular, he seems to have believed that the Sangha needed to be ruled more strictly. There needed to be stricter rules in particular around what food the monastics should eat, what kind of food, around what kind of clothing the monastics should wear, and about the monastics' living conditions. So, taken from a few steps back, it looks as though Devadatta began with good intentions. He was trying to make the Sangha better by strengthening or hardening some of the Buddha's rules, which he felt would be helpful. However, what happened was that Devadatta met with failure. He attempted to woo one of the local kings. He got on the king's good side. He went to the Buddha and tried to get the Buddha to resign from the Sangha so that Devadatta himself could take it over. The Buddha was not keen on this. Buddha did not agree with Devadatta's reformations. And so there was this fight essentially between Devadatta and the Buddha. Devadatta attempted to split the Sangha, that is to say, he went off with a group of monastics on his own, attempted to split the Sangha. There's stories that Devadatta tried to injure or kill the Buddha. In any event, he was not successful. A later sutta seems to reflect a time at which the Buddha tried to give instructions to his monastics in order to forestall this kind of thing from happening again. Now, this sutta, it's actually a pair of suttas, seems to some scholars, in particular Bhikkhu Sujato, to be late, to be something composed after the Buddha's lifetime. There are various relatively good reasons to believe this. However, all that aside, there's no way to prove it definitively. I think there's good reason to believe it, but let's leave that kind of thing aside for now and simply look at what the Buddha's purported to have suggested. He suggested that we look at our successes and failures, and I did a recent video about looking at failures, which I'll leave a link to down below, talking about this very sutta, but we're going to be discussing something a little different today. So what did the Buddha say? He said, the Buddha spoke to the mendicants about Devadatta. Mendicants, it's good for a mendicant to check their own failings. It's good for a mendicant to check the failings of others. It's good for a mendicant to check their own successes. It's good for a mendicant to check the successes of others. Overcome and overwhelmed by 8 things that oppose the true teaching, Devadatta is going to a place of loss, to hell, there to remain for an eon, irredeemable. Now, what are these 8 things that overwhelmed Devadatta? The Buddha says that they are gain and loss, fame and disgrace, honor and dishonor, corrupt wishes, and bad friendship. And this list seems to be very closely related to the list of what are known as the 8 worldly winds or worldly conditions of gain and loss, fame and dishonor, pleasure and pain, and blame and praise. So basically what the Buddha is saying here is that Devadatta was overtaken by these worldly desires. In other words, he perhaps began from a position of good intentions, but eventually was corrupted by these other desires that were in the background, this desire for, let's say, gain of some kind, the desire for fame, to avoid disgrace, perhaps that's why he tried to injure the Buddha, desire for praise from other monastics, perhaps. And in a general sense, a desire for gain, to avoid failure and to gain success. So what can we learn from Devadatta's example? Well, one key point from the early Buddhist Dharma is to be very wary of the desires for worldly successes and to avoid worldly failures. Because even we can begin with good intentions and end up in a place that harms ourselves and others if in the background of those good intentions lie these kinds of worldly desires. Now, for a recent example of this kind of syndrome, we can look to the cryptocurrency kingpin Sam Bankman-Fried. And there was a recent book about him called Number Go Up by Zeke Fox. I recommend the book. It'll give you something of a picture of the craziness involved in this whole scheme, and I'll leave a link to the book down below in the notes if you want to read more about that. But in any event, it seems as though Sam Bankman-Fried began with good intentions. That is to say, he began as, or at least he called himself, an effective altruist. Someone who wanted to make a ton of money in order to be able to donate that money to people and help out the world in a broad and useful way. However, later on, he, when interviewed, claimed that the ethics stuff was mostly a front. So we might wonder how much of this he held to with any kind of real conviction, and how much of it was done simply to put other people off the scent. It's hard to know for sure. However, what it was he was doing, he described as that sophisticated players would put more and more money in a certain kind of box, he said, and then the crypto token made out of the money in that box goes to infinity, and then everyone makes money. And this kind of general picture, I think, is not unreasonably compared to what's known as a Ponzi scheme, which is a corrupt way to take money from unsuspecting people. It's not a particularly healthy way to run a business, let's put it that way. And indeed, when Bankman-Fried's hedge fund, known as Alameda Research, began to lose money, his solution to this problem was to plug the hole in Alameda Research by taking customer funds from his own trading firm and using them to plug Alameda's failing balance sheet. In other words, he stole money from the customers who had given it to his cryptocurrency exchange FTX and moved it over to a place that actually helped him out. And, of course, presumably, he expected the cryptocurrency market to turn soon enough that he could undo all of this and make it go away, but the cryptocurrency market did not turn in time, and it all went down the hole. In all of this, Bankman-Fried counted, I think, on the sort of Wild West atmosphere of the cryptocurrency market, in which regulations are nearly non-existent, to expect that no one was looking too carefully at him, and so he could sort of do these kind of shenanigans under the table, and no one would be the wiser. The upshot here is that by striving corruptly to avoid this failure, he not only didn't avoid loss itself, but fell into disgrace and dishonor. So it's a sad story. As the Buddha goes on to say in this sutta, what advantage does a mendicant gain by overcoming these 8 things? The distressing and feverish defilements that might arise in someone who lives without overcoming these 8 things do not arise when they've overcome them. So the upshot here is that both Devadatta and Sam Bankman-Fried would have saved themselves a lot of trouble by giving up this kind of worldly desire for gain, for success. The Buddha famously said that our karma is due to our intentions. The character of our karma is due to the character of our intentions. In both of these cases, these people seem to have, at least we could grant them that they began with good intentions, perhaps. But in both cases, behind those good intentions or alongside them were other intentions, strong intentions for worldly gain, for worldly success, to avoid this kind of failure that we've been talking about. And these other overarching intentions overcame their good intentions that they began with and ended them up in misery. Perhaps that's why The Buddha, or some later monastic, suggested that we regularly check with our successes and our failures and those of people around us to see how they're affecting us. Are our successes and failures pushing us into unskillful directions? Is the fact that we're failing at something leading us in a path that is not healthy for us? Or is the fact that we're succeeding at something leading us in a path that's not healthy for us? In either of these cases, mindfulness is the answer, trying to check in with the goals that we've set for ourselves and our own intentions and see if they're tracking true or if we're being diverted in some way that we really ought not to be. And there are also some broader issues at work here that I think we ought to touch on a bit at the end. Living in a society such as ours, we can't, as lay people, legitimately completely give up the desire for gain, or at least the need for gain, because we require funds to be able to pay for things like healthcare, to pay for retirement, not to mention food and housing in the present moment. So living in a world like ours, we're not in a position to completely give up gain unless we want to become a monastic, and even that is an extremely limited opportunity for most of us, and the monastics themselves require lay support. Living in a country such as ours, where so many people feel that the government shouldn't be giving handouts to anybody, it's perhaps not unusual to find some people who decide that the best route forward is for them to pile up all the money that they can in order to help the people that, frankly, the government should be helping itself. If the government won't, perhaps Sam Bankman-Fried would have. At least that's the picture. Now, the question, of course, in the background, the picture in the background is this really an example of Robin Hood perhaps faking out the rich in order to give the money to the poor, or is it instead more an example of Willie Sutton, who's going to the bank because that's where the money is? One thing's for sure, we live in a topsy-turvy world. In any way, what are your thoughts about all of this? I'd be interested to know. As always, put them down below in the comments. I did a past video about these 8 worldly conditions or worldly winds and what the Buddha had to say about them in more detail, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. Thanks so much for all of your support. If you are interested in supporting the channel, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes. We could really use some help, of course, always. It's great to have more people involved, and you'll get something in return for your help. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.